Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, myself, Matthew, and normal guest Riki Hayashi are going to be taking some of your feedback. We've been having a lot of great things being written in, a lot of great questions being asked. And so I'm just kind of really excited to be able to dive into some of these and have some great conversations. I want to say at the start that we get this feedback. There's a lot of different ways you can give it. Anytime you have thoughts about what we discussed, questions you wish we'd explored further, comments you want to make, tell us how wrong we were about something, tell us about your own experiences with something. We always want to hear it. You can find us on email, on Twitter, on TikTok. All that information is in the show notes, or if you just go to the website, theethicalpanda.com, there you'll find all of it. And also just by searching for superhero superhero ethics or the ethical panda, that's generally the best way to find us. So with that, Riki, let me kind of just start with you and kind of what's your take overall on feedback and responding to listeners and making this more of a conversation.
I have some feedback for myself. Stop rambling so much, especially about Japanese politics.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I was, I
I
was,
thought it was great, but I hear where you're coming from.
if you're listening to this in sequence, I believe this one is going to come out after our Shin Godzilla
Yeah, that's correct.
episode. And when we got together, we kind of had a mission statement to return to like a central question. And I think we missed the mark a little on that because I got into the weeds.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I love feedback just as a general thing. And for this podcast, I love it because it's a conversation, right? Whether it's like an immediate conversation on Discord that we can have, or, someone sending in an email and then we respond, that's like a slower conversation. But to me, that's what makes fandom fun and
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And, for this podcast, like ethics, especially, we are probably going to disagree on a lot of things. Like you and I disagree on things, even though I would say, like 95% aligned
Yeah.
on ethics. It's the places where we disagree that can lead to the most interesting discussions. So bringing in other opinions and other
Right.
perspectives from the audience can help with that.
I think that's a great point. And I really like that you use the words discussion and dialogue instead of debate. Because to me, there's an awful lot of debate on the internet. And a lot of it can be useful. A lot of it, though, is either basically people claiming opinion as fact. This is a good movie. This isn't a good movie. And then just repeating that infinitum. Or often just like not even agreeing on facts. Like, oh, no one went to see this movie. No, lots of people went to see this movie. Or, whatever that is. And I'm much more interested yet in the discussion and like how can we learn from each other. And I think my knowledge about these stories has really grown in part because of all the great feedback we get. And like one thing I like doing this podcast with you, Riki, is that you and I share a lot of experiences, but we also have a lot of very different backgrounds. We can grow from that. But obviously, like we're both male presenting people. We're both folks who've mostly grown up in the United States, or at least some of it, and live in the United States. Like there's a lot of ways in which our perspectives are fairly similar. And same thing over on the Star Wars podcast. And so hearing from people of all backgrounds, has really been helpful. And then even when it's a little bit, hard, don't just come in to yell at us. But a while ago, when it was when it was Jake and myself, Becky Allen, who's been a great friend of the podcast and a frequent guest and commenter, she pointed out something that he and I had mentioned where we hadn't really understood the gender aspect of it, and had said something that she I think rightly found kind of problematic. And we listened to that, we took that in, and we did an apology, but also really kind of helped to change and shape where what we were doing going forward. So yeah, always want to hear your thoughts, always want to hear feedback and stuff like that. One thing in particular I want to say is that feedback is always meant welcome by everyone, but of course the some of the one of the best ways you can do to help support this podcast and get more info about the podcast is by becoming a member. Becoming a member, you get ad-free episodes, you get bonus episodes. We've not been as good as I want about producing those. The last couple weeks we haven't had bonus content, but that's going to be changing starting this week. But most of all, you're also just helping us keep the lights on, helping us do the things we're doing. And so I want to particularly thank Steve Maloney. He's our newest member. Uh, it's only $5 a month, $60, $55 a year. Steve will be getting all that great bonus content. So, Steve, thank you so much for being a supporter of the podcast, and feel free to write in anytime. With that,
Awesome.
So with that, let's turn to some of our feedback. And we have one long email about, actually, it was a series of Discord posts about the X-Men show that we did. And we're going to kind of maybe do a couple of those and then do other things and then go back to that. Because there's a lot of different points to it. But I want to start with a couple of the smaller questions we got. Um, on our episode about learning from failure, we had two comments, and I just want to read both of them to you, Riki, and hear your thoughts and feedback. First, First of all, Chris McCardle, who's a friend of mine and a pastoral colleague, wrote in, failure is a good teacher so long as you try again and learn from it. If you fail and quit, as Luke did with Ray and Yoda until Yoda came calling, it can't teach. And then Lars Peter Savan, who I know because he ran karaoke for a long time in Madison, just a wonderful entertainer and great guy, writes, failure can be the most instructive teacher you will ever have, but you have to pay attention to the lesson instead of being frustrated by the failure. That's paramount. The lesson learned is what could be different instead of what went wrong, and that's the end of the thought process. Simplified example in science. How many attempts were made to make something work before it works? How many mistakes are made making something that causes you to find something else that's even more interesting?
Yeah, both those are great follow-up feedback on that. For me, like I've been playing a mobile game called Marvel Strike Force, and it's just like a simple hero collector game where you
Mm-hmm.
get teams of 5 Marvel heroes or villains, and then you fight against other groups. And the biggest thing in the community is like what team beats what other team. And then there are websites or like content creators who produce videos about like how, what beats what. And then people get frustrated when they're like, well, like this team that you said is a counter to this other team doesn't work. And they just like get mad and like
Yeah.
blame the content creator. And they don't like look into why it didn't work. Right. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing, like the lessons learned that Lars mentioned. Like what
Yeah.
could be different? Like how did you play the matchup? Why didn't it work? Can you play it differently in another way that will make it work? And is that missing piece, right?
Right. Yeah, I really love these two comments together because they kind of form they're looking at the thing in the two steps that I think are necessary. One is that when you fail, you can't just quit and give up. I mean, it is okay to sometimes say like, I'm not good at this. I don't want to keep trying. That is okay. But that just the if you give up, you're not going to be learning anything from the failure. But the second thing of being like, how is it you learn? Because part of what I hear and what Lars is saying, and I think in what you're saying as well, I think for a lot of us, when we fail, it can send us into these spirals of guilt or shame or self doubt or something like that.
Or
And
blame.
yeah, blame. And it's kind of like we talked about a couple episodes ago, the ability to stop saying, like, oh, I'm bad because I didn't do this well, or oh, I can't, beating myself up for making this mistake. Instead, it's the how can I use this to focus on going forward? And recognizing that, you know, um, this story may be apocryphal, but the story of I think it's Thomas Edison who was asked like Thomas Edison said to someone like that he had tried hundreds of different things that didn't work as a filament for the light bulb, and someone said like, "Are you really upset about that?" He's like, "No." They said, "Are you really upset that you haven't learned anything?" And he said, "No, I have learned that hundreds of these things don't work. That's important to learn in figuring out what does work." And so yeah, I think that's like failure can be frustrating, recognizing that when you're just failing in the same way or that you're failing because you don't have the resources or the mindset or whatever you need and that maybe it's time to stop trying for a while, that's perfectly valid. But yeah, I think that failure is a teacher, but when we're ready to listen to it and when we're ready to try again, even if that's trying something else entirely.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's complicated because sometimes the ultimate lesson is that the thing is not for you.
Yeah.
And that can be like the most disappointing thing, but it is perhaps a lesson that you need to learn and to stop spending your time on that thing. And I don't say that lightly, right? Because we're talking about failure and quitting, and like you shouldn't quit, you should persevere. but I do believe that there are moments where it is important to quit or to stop something. It's a better way of putting it,
Mhm.
um, because it's not everything is for everyone. And
Yeah.
on this show, when we talk about fandom, we talk about what we enjoy, but also what we don't enjoy. And sometimes there are just popular things that we personally don't enjoy. And I don't think people should force themselves to watch or listen to something just because it's popular.
Yeah.
If you know and understand that you are not kind of the target audience for it.
Yeah. Totally agree. Totally agree. All right, let's look at some of this parts of this X-Men email we got. And this all comes from Paul. Actually, let me do it this way, so I'm still facing the same way. And this was a great Discord post. Discord is another one of the great ways to contact us. Um, Paul Meteoroplum Lee. And he writes, okay, I've gotten both episodes in, talking about our two episodes, and I want to amplify a couple ideas that were mentioned but not explored by either Matthew or Ricky or the Podcastic Four, because I had two different groups on to discuss these. First one, he says, X-Men 97 is horny. Disney didn't put in any content warnings, but boy, it didn't try very hard to hide stuff. We have at least three separate love triangles: Scott Jean Logan, Scott Jean Madeline, and Rogue Gambit Magneto. We also have Jubilee Roberto, Ojara Forge, Professor X Lilandra, Hank Trish, Tibley, and probably and arguably Professor X Magneto. Logan and also Logan and Morph. Dang. Also arguably hornier than any of the live action Fox movies that doesn't have Deadpool in the title. What's your thoughts?
Yeah. That was Aurora, right? Aurora Storm. And I want to point out the last one that Paul mentioned, Logan Morph. I think I had kind of mentioned it, but after we recorded, it was confirmed by the showrunner, Bodamayo, that Morph's confession to Logan on what
Mm,
kind of appeared to be Logan's deathbed was their real emotions towards Logan. And so it was a small thing, and it's something hopefully in season two they choose to explore some more. But it was confirmed that that was meant to be Morph's true feelings and not just a I'm going to turn into Jean and pretend to say this thing that will help you
right.
to claw back from death.
Yeah. I think that's true. And yeah, like I'm glad we talked about that specific one. And just to the general point, I would agree. I think there's a lot more sexual tension and discussion of sexuality in this show, and I don't think that's a bad thing. On a couple of levels. One is that I think we often are a little bit more nervous about it in animated shows because there is still this idea that animated means it's more for children. And I don't think that this show, like, I don't think this show is Deadpool in the kind of like parental warning necessarily, but I think that there are a number of love triangles and that there's a healthy amount of sexual tension involved. And that, when I don't need to see explicit sex by any means, I don't need to see discussions about like how far did these different couples go at all, but recognizing that these people are hot for each other and that that's an important part of life. I think sometimes like the media that we think kids might be interested in can appear very chaste. And if it's actually like media for kids, sure. But for something like this, where it's about adults and lots of people are enjoying it of all ages, I don't think there's anything wrong with this level of, very not explicit, but clearly, some innuendos happening, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction to the feedback was a X-Men has always been quote unquote horny.
Yep.
Whether you're talking about the comics, I believe the original animated series was also quite horny. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, Rogue Gambit as a pair is like as it it is this representation of the teenage years, right? Of
Right.
not being able to touch, literally for them. But for teenagers, often like there's the tension of how far you carry a relationship, right? Like
Right.
the various bases, as we call them. And so like it is, I feel it has always been like this direct metaphor for that. And the X-Men movies really like PGified it, right?
Yeah.
The rogue angle. where yes, she wanted that, but it was always just like touching hands. Whereas
Right.
the X-Men 97 definitely like ramped up the uh
Well, in part
the
because they made Rogue
explicit.
a lot younger. They made Rogue kind of a younger teenager.
In the movies, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
definitely. And I'll also say, I mean, if nothing else, look at the costumes that a lot of the characters, especially the women, but even some like the men are often having like very well defined pecs, and they're definitely sometimes wearing shorts that show quite a lot, leave little to the imagination. So yeah, there's always been some aspect of that in this, and I'd say for the most part we didn't get that with Goblin Queen being a very notable exception. Not a bad one necessarily, but a very
I
notable
also
exception.
add Gambit too. Gambit
Yeah,
had the cut off T-shirt when he was cooking beignets, and then when they played basketball, he took off his shirt. It's like,
yep.
okay, Gambit, calm down, or maybe I need to calm down.
They know the audience. They know the audience likes these things.
And
All right.
also like my secondary reaction was, yes, the 97 had more, but boy
Mm-hmm.
howdy, like compared to pretty much any Japanese anime, was it
Yeah.
tame.
Yeah. All right. So the second point is I want to reiterate Riki's point about the lack of difference between segregation and separation. Separation looks like segregation the moment you go to a wider lens. Magneto grits his teeth while trying to tell the X Men that he's working on coexistence with non mutants, and he also says it to the UN judges and Val Cooper. Same episode, Bastion wanting to enslave the mutants is bad, but not surprising. It's the number of people who are willing to help Bastion and are non consensually converted to prime sentience who prove Magneto's worst fears. That and President Kelly launching the missiles. If you're not going to say Magneto was right, you also can't fairly claim that Professor X was right.
Yeah, so this is regarding we had a brief discussion about Genosha, the mutant
Uh huh.
nation of Genosha being a separate state, and whether that was a form of segregation. And we had a discussion about that because I think my opinion was that it was, even though it
Mm-hmm.
was a nation willfully created by and for mutants on the world stage, it was still a segregated, literally an island
Right.
nation that was, separate
Mm-hmm.
from humans. And if you just collect all of the mutants in this one island, then to me that is not coexistence.
Right. I'm I'm torn on this because to me, I do think the power differential and where the power is coming from is very important. And segregation to me is about the overclass creating a situation in which, you know, the undergroups, whether that's on in lines of race, gender, religion, class, whatever it is, that they are kept separate, and that intentionally it's set up in a way that they are disempowered through that separation, that they never get the opportunities and the chances and the resources that those in the higher groups do. Everything from, the literal segregation of education and work and all that kind of thing to, boys only clubs at schools and colleges and like, workplace trips to places women are often not going to be comfortable going, all that kind of stuff. Separation to me, when separation is being driven by the minority group saying, right now we need a chance to have our own separate place where we are not always the 1 out of 10, where we're not always being shamed by the white supremacy culture, but that we can have a place to gather our own strength and to give our children role models and to live apart from the supremacy. I do see a lot of value in. And I think we don't really get to know enough about Genosha here because I think if it's something where, well, because you created it, then the rest of the world is saying all the mutants have to go there, then yes, I agree we get to a problematic place. But I think when it's, for example, like in this country, we no longer have segregated higher education. We do have the historically black colleges where students can go and they know that, if they're black, that they're going to be primarily around other people like them, and that they're primarily going to be around, resources and things that are focused on the particular challenges that they face, and recognizing that that's a very wide range. But like white students can apply. It's not that those people aren't allowed. It's that the space is being created specifically for this one group, and probably they would, be somewhat race sensitive about making sure that it's not taken over by a different group or something like that. If a whole bunch of white people all applied one year. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm to me it's a little bit more of a case. I don't think separation is always segregation, but I think it definitely can be, and it's something to have a real kind of red flag about.
Yeah, to me, your comparison to historical black colleges, I would say that that is a waypoint
Hmm.
in the progress and should not be like an end goal. So like Genosha as a nation, I don't have a problem with it existing, but I think what the problem I have is presenting it potentially as an end goal for mutant
Hmm.
kind of saying, now that we have Genosha, we're set, we're free, like we're done. Like that is only the beginning. And then you have to have the conversation with the human United Nations, the human controlled United Nations about how do we move forward for
Right.
true coexistence and for true integration of mutants and humans everywhere rather than just setting Genosha apart as this thing and leaving it alone.
Right. I hear that, but I think it has to come from the desire of the oppressed group to want to reintegrate or to want coexistence. And that until that happens, like to me, it's not something that the over groups should try to force of saying like, well, you can't be on Genosha forever. Eventually you have to come be a part of our society again.
Um, I, okay,
Like,
I had a reaction and I'm not sure what I'm reacting to.
okay,
But when I hear that, like the Uber group, as you call it, the United Nations, I'm just going to say United Nations should work to help mutants in their nations
right.
and not just to send them to Genosha. Like that's the issue I see developing in the
Yeah,
Genosha situation.
if anyone is ever for like, yeah, if white colleges said we're not going to accept you into Princeton because you can go to Moorhead, like that's not acceptable at all. Like I'm
Yeah,
totally with you on that. But in the same way, for me as a white person, I don't think it's ever my place to say, you know what, we don't need the historically black colleges anymore. That should be for black
sure.
people to say. And I'm we're focusing on that example because it's an easy one to talk about, but that is by no means the other example. I mean, there's women only spaces. There's uh, all throughout Pride. Pride is a big thing about like all queer people and their allies and supporters and family coming together. But there's also important, like there are going to be trans only spaces and gay men only spaces and sapphic women or lesbian only spaces. And I think all those things are important too.
All right, let's I think move
Let's move
on.
on.
Yeah.
And again, yeah, we're not always going to agree, and that's okay. Um, so here's one that you and I talked a good deal about. So it's interesting to get some more feedback on. And this is all again from the same person, Paul Lee. The The story with Professor X and Linandra is both fan service, more about that in another point, and a way to sneak in a non subtle compare and contrast with the treatment of mutants on Earth. While I agree that the Shi'ar is meant to be an example of colonialism, the astral projection classroom session shows that the Shi'ar does to its subject races what seems like a very similar process of mutant assimilation into non mutant society. But like what Magneto advocates, but like when but ironically, sorry, but ironically, the version of integration Professor X suggests sounds much more like what Magneto advocates. Unfortunately, this is sandwiched between Professor X Linandra horniness, death birds, and a considerable portion of Shi'ar society's racism, and Charles's vision of Gambit as a skeleton and Life Death Part 2. The amount of story that had to be packed into Season 1, Episode 6 meant that it was easy to dismiss this point, but I want to point out that's literally the writers saying Magneto was right.
Yeah,
Uh,
that episode, in my opinion, was probably the weakest episode in the season, and just kind of a mess because of how they had to cram it in,
yeah.
as Paul said. Because I agree with everything about the
Mhm.
Shi'ar. It is a literal colonial empire that professes to know what's best for its people, who are
Mhm.
subjugated in a way that isn't overtly slavery, but it is presented as a class system that does not favor some of these people.
Yeah, and I have to take your word on that because I don't remember a single detail because I and maybe this is like maybe the perfect fan is sitting there watching every detail. And again, I think because you pointed out that a lot of this is in the original X-Men series, and so if it just wasn't for me, that's fine. I'm not saying it's a critique, but for me, introducing a whole new society in episode 6 and a whole new story about them when I'm already deeply invested in all these stories and I want to make sure I get back to those stories, I just didn't care. I had there was no reason for me to pay attention to those details because it did feel like it was going to be a one off. It did feel like whatever happened, the point of it was Professor X comes back, and I'm sure that if I had been paying more attention, I would have gotten more out of it. And that you can say that's just on me, but I think it's also a kind of like you're taking a drink from a fire hose at that point. Like there's just so much they're trying to tell you in so little time that I think I think there's some justification in feeling kind of overwhelmed and checking out a little bit at that point. But yeah, hearing more about it, it does make sense to me why it's a good point. I just think again it could have been better integrated in.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think what they're doing is the Deathbird character in the comics has been one of Apocalypse's horsemen from time to
Mm,
time. So I think they have to have her there to set up that possibility to leave it open.
mm, that's
And
fair.
also, like, they had to get Professor X back because of where
Right,
he starts this series.
right. That's fair. All right. Well, not wanting to just do too much in the X Men. We have a couple more of those points we're going to get to, but I wanted to go to some of the other feedback we had. Um, so we just did that episode about why heroes fall. We talked especially about Anakin, but also about some other things. And this feedback comes from Jared Silva, someone Riki and I both know well. Um, and Jared writes, really interesting episode, and I love the way that Matthew and Riki challenged each other respectfully around the question of balancing personal accountability and responsibility with the negative influences around a character. One thing that wasn't addressed that I think is relevant for discussion is child soldiers and others who are faced with a choice between death and committing evil acts. It serves as the extreme example of when there's a point where it is not reasonable to expect a person to make the right choice. I don't think Anakin or Eric Killmonger fits that part of the spectrum, but I believe that it's a useful extreme when constructing the spectrum of responsibility, with the other extreme being a person with a means for full self determination. There are obviously other axes of responsibility, but I find this one useful in discussions of personal responsibility. Ironically, I think that many Jedi, such as Ahsoka, who have been raised at the temple since childhood, actually fall closer to child soldier end of the spectrum than Anakin, who was pilled in the order later, although still as a child. In the Clone Wars series, especially early on, I think it's very difficult to expect Ahsoka to fully understand the moral consequences of her action as a 13-year-old Jedi fighting in the middle of a galactic civil war.
Yeah, this is a subject that I have some interest in. I've suggested to Matthew as a
Mm-hmm.
future like full episode topic, which is child soldiers. Because oh my goodness, as Jared mentioned, like Ahsoka and many of the Padawans, Barriss
Mm-hmm.
Offee, a character we've
Yeah.
revisited recently, were literal teenagers, and they were what commanders. All the
Mm-hmm.
Padawans held the rank of commander, and the Jedi held the rank of general
Yep.
in the Grand Republic Army. And that's just like it's kind of slipped into Star Wars and accepted, but that's a huge deal, right?
It
If
really
you
is.
think about it from a real life perspective. And then I started thinking, and it's just every mecha anime that I watch
Uh huh.
has child soldiers because I think
Mm,
the use of mecha allows for that, right? It
yeah.
allows for an underdeveloped human being to be able to fight in a real war as an equal or better against adults.
Right.
And it's also just because anime is often aimed towards kids or young adults, you want to have protagonists that they can relate to, and that's
Yeah.
just kind of how it has ended up as a trope pretty much. And yeah, I think like a fuller exploration of this, because
Mm-hmm.
it is also present in Western media as well. Um,
Yep.
Star Wars was one. I mentioned Ender's Game as another prominent
Mm-hmm.
example of child
Yep.
soldiers, where again, like technology equalizes things.
Yeah. I think it's such a good point, and like I'm glad we didn't get this story, but obviously I think there's an alternate universe in which Ahsoka follows Anakin to the dark side, and if that had happened, again, it's not about moral blame necessarily, but I am probably going to be a lot more sympathetic to Ahsoka because this is the she is a child. She isn't someone her ideas and morality and all that stuff is still forming, and Anakin is this basically closest thing she has to a parent or an older sibling, and she's following where he goes. In the same way, I think this is something I probably should have thought of before, but I think any conversation about Barris Offee has to be discussed in these terms because if nothing else, one of the questions I think it's often asked is, well, once Barris decides that she thinks the Jedi are wrong, why is it that the only way she can express that is through violence? What has she been taught? Literally since, almost after birth, that the issues of the galaxy have to be settled through violence because and maybe that's not the Jedi way, but it's definitely the commander general army of the Republic way. I don't think it's intentional by any means, but and if you look at there's been a lot of great studies of real life child soldiers looking everything from like some of the child armies in Africa to kids who grow up in gangs, whether that's like South Central LA or Northern Ireland, Belfast. Like it's by no means like only one race. Growing up where all the role models they have are also in these violent gangs or whatever else it is. Um, and a lot of study about that. Yeah, that even long after you leave that community, you've been taught from a very early age that settling things through violence is the right way to do that, and that is a really hard thing to unlearn, and that's an awful lot of work that would need to be unlearned. And it, in some of the other media we've been seeing, especially in the video games and some of the books, that a lot of the Padawans who survive Order 66 turn to the dark side and become the Inquisitors and things like that. And while that's not good, I again would have a lot more sympathy than for an adult who turns to the dark side because of what it means to be raised as a child soldier like that.
Well, that's interesting. But the adults have also been indoctrinated. Like if we're talking about Jedi, the adults
Mhm.
have already, I'll say, suffered decades of their of life
Yeah,
indoctrination by the Jedi Order.
yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think
So,
I think that the indoctrination is there, and so I think like I might refer to Anakin as a former child soldier in some ways, but the war doesn't really start until he's 18 or 19. Like
mhm.
for most of it, he is being indoctrinated into the life of a peacekeeper who is somewhat of a soldier, but he's not a general as a child. He's not a commander of military people as a child in the way that I think the people who are the Padawan ages are.
Yeah. I mean, all of this is kind of an ongoing discussion and an ongoing
Mhm.
development in Star Wars media because we continue to get things like Tales of the Jedi, the Dooku stories, for example,
Right.
showing Dooku's fall to the dark side, but also showing that the Jedi Order was already like not a good thing. And that,
Right.
I mean, say Magneto was right, like in some ways, like that's showing like Dooku was right to
Yeah.
leave the Jedi Order.
Yeah.
Like I
I
think he
think
was
so.
wrong to embrace Palpatine and the Sith, but like the the continuation of the line from Dooku to Qui Gon Jinn to Obi Wan to Anakin, right? Like master to apprentice,
Hmm.
like is a kind of a line of defiance to the Jedi Order in their own different ways, like to different
Yeah.
degrees.
And you have not yet seen The Acolyte, correct?
I have not, no.
Okay.
No,
I won't
no, no,
mention
no.
that.
I will. I want to, but I'm just. There's been a lot of other things.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I'll just say that whenever you do get to watching it, it also addresses these issues in some great ways that are much more morally gray without being like this side good, this side bad. Yeah. So Jared, great question, and there's a whole other part to Jared's question that we haven't gone into as much about the like how do you hold someone responsible for a choice where their only choice is they do something bad or something terrible is done to them and or their family or community or whatever it is. And I think that in itself, that and crowd soldiers probably warrant their whole other issue episode. So we'll definitely get back to that. Um, other things I wanted to say was that as part of the villains who had a point, Rusticles, who's on our Discord, wrote in and said two things. First of all, he said, I just really appreciate this myself, because I talked about being sick for a while. He said, "Hi, Matthew. I'm currently listening to your latest podcast. Just wanted to pass on my sincere well wishes for your health, and I hope you make a full recovery in your own time. You've been highly prolific, and there's a plethora of material us listeners can delve into while you rest. Take care," says Rusty. And just that really means a lot. Like, we are here to produce content for you, and and hopefully you are supporting us, whether it's like listening to the ads or becoming members. And so, I don't expect that kind of consideration, but we are real people and we have stuff that we go through. And I try to always make sure we keep you the same level of content, but sometimes that does suffer a bit. And so, just want to say, Rusty, how much I appreciate this and how much I appreciate the you reaching out and saying that. And then the other thing he said was, specific in terms that the villains who had a point, and here's referring to the Spider-Man Homecoming movie. I feel a bit sorry for Adrian Toomes slash the Vulture, actually. He was trying to make a living and take care of the family and employees initially. More so in Homecoming, the movie, as in the comics, I always saw him as a bit of a lame old man. Actually, I think, nah. Yeah, so I think I definitely agree. I think that's one of the things that I like so much about Homecoming is, and part of this is because Michael Keaton is a great actor, but they make Vulture a very sympathetic character who then I think does go too far. But I think part of what makes him a perfect fit for Spider-Man is I think Spider-Man, as much as he like mocks people and bullies them some and like trash talks them, he also I think is often the most sympathetic to his villains, to his rogue squad, and has sympathy of like, yeah, you got screwed and like you shouldn't be going in this direction, and I'm going to stop you if you go in that direction. But I also have sympathy for what happened to you, and I want to fix that if I can. And I think the most recent Spider-Man No Way Home really exemplified this. But even in Homecoming, I think Vulture was just the perfect character to start that off with.
Yeah. Excuse me. Vulture, they even they had like a couple of very good conversations,
Mm-hmm.
Vulture and Spider-Man in that movie, and even right down to Peter choosing to save him at the end was a perfect encapsulation of Peter Parker as a character. And yeah, I agree that in No Way Home, like they took that to 100 with him
Mm-hmm.
choosing to save all of the villains. I think it's a little. I wish it had been more people that he had a connection to. Right, might have been more even better, but it worked because like they were great actors. Like
Right.
being able to bring back Willem Dafoe is fantastic,
Yeah.
but him lacking the personal history and connection with those specific villains made it just like a little less, like not a
No,
huge
I
amount,
can see that.
but I think it could have been. But it was a good way to utilize them.
Definitely. And I continue to think that the car scene where, Tomes is driving Peter Parker and Peter Parker's girlfriend, Tomes' daughter, to the prom or to the homecoming dance, whatever it is, and they're in the car when Peter and Tomes figure out that they are who each other is just one of the best scenes I've ever seen in a
Hmm.
Marvel movie.
Well, Peter knows right off the bat because he's seen him, right? Like
That's
as
right.
soon as the door opens, he knows. But yeah,
That's right.
it
That's
was
right.
Toombs figuring out, like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
and the use of like that scene is great
Yeah.
from a writing and dialogue perspective. But have you paid attention to the street lights or the
No.
the traffic lights? The way that the traffic lights reflect off of Adrian Toombs' face, like the red and the green, are
Mm-hmm.
very like indicative of his like emotions and like I think his understanding of who Peter is. So
Oh, that's
pay
cool.
attention to that next time.
Okay. Yeah, if I can find a link, I'll probably include it in the show notes. That sounds wonderful. Let's wrap up with the last 2 points about the X-Men, and then we'll have a feedback session. We'll have a bonus section for our members. So the other things that Paul writes are: I've read exactly 2 issues of X-Men comics, saw one episode of the original animated show, and all the Fox movies. Well, again, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be a new fan as much as you need. I only recognized 4 of Morph's transformations that wasn't an X-Men in the show. but all of those transformations had a meaningful context in the stories being told, so I wasn't annoyed. There were also the changes in the opening credits from episode to episode, especially taken from the original series and reanimated, but they foreshadowed either something we saw in the episode or something we should expect in season 2. So again, not annoyed. As for the abbreviated telling of the Scott Madeline story, that leads into, and so here's this point 5, so we'll just do both these together. Point 5, what is X-Men 97? It is the continuation of the 90s animated X-Men show from Fox in the 90s aesthetic. What is it adapting if it's not going to showcase original stories? It could limit itself to X-Men comics published through 1997, but it apparently hasn't. Presumably, behind the scenes, Kevin Feige et al. Have set out some ground rules for which stories the new X-Men movies will get into. Ditto live action Fantastic Four and 97. It is entirely reasonable for 97 to leverage all the plot lines already depicted in the original series, which got us the Shi'ar, Phoenix, Cable, and Player Not voiced by Oscar Isaac. Uh, Making Cable an important character suggests bringing in Madeline, which also suggests bringing in Sinister. Yes, the showrunner and writer could have made different choices, but these aren't inherently bad choices, just not ones universally liked. And yeah, I think that's great, especially because, I was often saying that for me, some of the reasons why I had problems with the choices was that I was a newer fan to this, that I didn't have all the background. And I think it's great that Paul is in a similar place to me, but had a very different reaction to it. Like, I don't speak for all people who didn't come in seeing it. I think I probably speak for some, but I think a lot of others are probably where Paul is, and that's awesome. And I really like, Paul, the way you kind of did that analysis of really looking at what is this show trying to do, and how well did it do it, and that's how we should look at it. And I think that that's a totally fair analysis.
Yeah, so what did you think, Matthew, of all of Morph's transformations, like during the battles?
Um,
Did you recognize all of them, most of them? Where were you at on that?
so first of all, I'm the weirdo who loves superhero movies but doesn't like fight scenes very much. So I kind of wish they had happened outside of fight scenes because then I would be able. I think I would have noticed them more because during the fight scenes it just feels like it's so frenetic and there's so much happening on the screen that it's hard for me to keep track of it. Like I remember him turning into Hulk and doing a Hulk smash, but that's the only one I remember. And I'm sure I saw the other ones and like recognized them in the moment. Um, yeah, I didn't mind it. Definitely, it felt like fan service, and I wish that I'd gotten to know more of Morph's character, and we'd gotten more about him, and gotten to understand more of like why he does the morphs that he does and how he chooses and stuff like that. But I thought it was fine. It didn't bother me. It just was one. To me, it was one of the parts of the fire hose that was hitting me on the face, and not necessarily I was drinking it down.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I recognize every single character, I would say, off the top of my head. And what I liked was the way that they utilized powers,
Mm-hmm.
because it wasn't just Morph turning into the Hulk, but seemingly they had at least some part of Hulk's strength.
Yeah.
And other battles, like you could see them like actually using the powers. I don't know how that works, because this is a kind of a new-ish character to
Mm-hmm.
X-Men lore, that they are like kind of like Harley Quinn. Like it,
Yeah.
I think started on the original animated series and has been added to comics, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not like, it doesn't have like the decades of history that like a
Right.
Cyclops does. So it's I got tricked a couple times where I was like, "Oh, is Colossus in this battle?" It's like, no, just Morph again.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I
The
just want to say, oh, go ahead.
One of Paul's other points was about the opening credits, and I responded on Discord about this. I liked the way that they utilized the roll call in the opening
Mm,
credits to indicate the changing nature of the team. I don't want to get too into it, but when certain characters left the team or rejoined the team for whatever reason, they were added or removed from the opening credit lineup where each of their
mm-hmm.
names is on screen, right? I like that. I like when shows use real estate like that in opening credits to
Mm-hmm.
subtly give us something. What I
Yeah.
didn't like was the kind of previous scenes from X-Men that they used.
Mm.
This show is in a weird spot, and Paul mentions this. Like, is it supposed to be a sequel or a continuation of the animated series? It's unclear. Like, yes, like they are continuing characterization and storylines, but obviously from a television show and animation perspective, it's not. Like, literally, it can't be a, um,
Oh, so are you
a
saying that
continuation.
some of the previously on scenes were from the original show?
Yes, all I'm pretty much all of them. Well, okay.
Oh,
So
interesting.
what I mean is there's a section of previously on X-Men 97
Mm.
as a bumper, and they show literal scenes from X-Men 97 episodes, right?
Right.
But during the opening credits, they have cuts of battles or encounters with characters that
Oh, I
are
see. Okay.
references to things that
Right.
happen in the animated series, the original show.
Mm.
And in particular, what I didn't like was that they kept showing the Phoenix. I think maybe about halfway through the series, like they kept
Mhm.
showing this one shot of Jean becoming the Phoenix with the arms outstretched and lighting on fire. And I
Right.
think another one they kept showing was Apocalypse shooting like his big arm cannon or something like that. And they just like hammered it in like Phoenix, Apocalypse. And those characters kept not showing up, and it's like, okay, like the way that they are doing it, they're kind of giving us reminders of what happened in the animated
Mhm.
series for fans of that show, and kind of subtly hinting at like, okay, but in this episode we're going to have this character. I think they had Lilandra
Yeah.
in the opening credits of that episode where the Shi'ar Empire was prominently in.
Yeah.
So based on that, I was like, they've shown like the Phoenix Apocalypse thing so much, like it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Whereas if they don't have that, it leaves it a little more mysterious.
Yeah, I'll say I missed all that for exactly that reason because I just always, always, always hit skip to opening credits and to previously on because so often you get spoiled. There'll be a show where previously on it's showing you something about a character who hasn't appeared in 2 seasons. It's like, oh, well, clearly that character is coming back this episode. Um, I will say the one thing
I
of those that I did see was the end credits. Those I really appreciated and kind of didn't skip because they actually gave little blurbs about the powers that each character had. Because I didn't often understand exactly what each power could do, so I
oh
really
yeah, yeah.
appreciated that.
I I mean, this is something I think you and I disagree on heavily, is like
Hmm.
trailers, spoilers, etc. I think it's very important to watch those things,
Mm,
um, because you need that reminder. Like if you don't watch the previously on, and like you get right into an episode and there's some character, you're like, who the heck was this character? And you just want that like little scene of like what they did before as a reminder.
I think if I'm watching a show week to week and it's something that happened like a month ago, then possibly.
I
But
mean, we're
often
talking
I'm not.
seasons ago, right?
But I'm often if I'm binging a show, then I probably watched that other season 5 days ago and not 2 years ago.
Like the Mandalorian season 3,
Hmm.
right, had that diversion with Dr. Pershing, the cloner on
Yeah.
Coruscant. And I believe before that episode, it's like previously on The Mandalorian, and they showed him like from season 1, maybe? I
Hmm.
can't even remember now. Probably season 1, talking about M counts to Gideon, right?
Right.
Was the thing, was his primary thing. So if you don't watch that, you might be like, who is the scientist?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I just have a
So
good memory for those things. Like as well as rewatching stuff. I have never found like that I wished I had seen the previously on because it also would have better understood something. But I have many times felt like because of the previously on, I didn't enjoy a surprise as much as I think I would have.
hmm.
It's just different ways people appreciate things. That's fine. Um, All right. Well, Riki, thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you to all of our listeners. This has been fantastic. We're going to keep collecting all your feedback and hopefully keep doing more of these episodes as well as sprinkling in feedback during our regular episodes. For our members, please stick around because we'll have some bonus content. We're going to talk about some of what all this X-Men stuff means for Marvel going forward. But most importantly, thank you all so much. Please leave a review. Please leave us feedback. Please tell us your thoughts. Please become a member. We have spoken.
Previously on superhero ethics.
Exactly. Um, well, and this is something that a couple of our listeners mentioned, so I wanted to bring it up to you directly.
I'm
Now that
sorry,
we've
I'm being accosted by cats right now. They're
okay,
they're coming out of the woodworks.
I will edit out. No, I will not edit out the meows. Our listeners will probably want to hear that more than
Oh,
you
there
or
they
I.
go.
Now that we've seen this show, X-Men '97, how does it leave you feeling about more live-action X-Men, particularly in the
Is this our
MCU side?
bonus content?
Yep.
Okay. How do I feel about live action X-Men? Maybe this is my controversial X-Men take. Don't do it.
Okay. Okay.
Leave it in animated. I don't know. Like I thoroughly enjoyed X-Men 97
Mhm.
and uh recently rewatched the original X-Men movie 2000, I guess. I don't know what year that was. And it was disappointing for a lot of reasons. And I think one of the reasons is the contrast, especially of Cyclops and what he is able to do with his optic blasts on the show and utilize them to literally like move around, like push himself, because like that's what it's supposed to be, not a heat ray. Um, I don't know if they can, even now with the technology and everything, I don't know if they can pull off that
Yeah.
in live action. I don't know if they can pull off uh like they've had Colossus as a character and they've tried to do fastball specials and it's been underwhelming. For what the fastball special is supposed to be, it was underwhelming.
Yeah. I think I have two feelings on it. One is that just very much agreeing, like the stories have been told, and I don't necessarily need them retold just to
Oh,
fit the MCU.
yeah.
I don't want it. Like I think the casting of some of those core characters, especially Magneto, Professor X, and Logan, I don't want to see anyone but Hugh Jackman play Logan for 20 or 30 more years. I don't think there's any need.
I do.
Um, well,
I
for whatever
I want an actual short king to play Logan.
that, yeah, and that's again because since I didn't watch anything beforehand, his height has nothing to do with his character for me. But I can totally see why it would matter to someone else.
It's like one
Um,
of the
but like so there's but also I just think like in both older and younger, I think the actors who they got, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Michael Fassbender, and James McAvoy have all just been so good. I so and we've seen
but
those stories, so I kind of would want to see like newer X-Men. The other issue is that at this point, like Tony Stark's original story was set during Vietnam, that he's selling
yes.
weapons to the Americans during Vietnam. But it's not essential to his story that it be in Vietnam, and so for the MCU, they updated it to the Iraq War, and I think that was
Hmm.
fine. I think, particularly because we still have so few Jewish characters in comic books, and especially so many who their Judaism gets whitewashed by the time they are brought over on screen. I think Magneto being a Jewish Holocaust survivor is a very important part of his story. Now, I think there are, and I think there's a lot of good talk right now about making Magneto and Professor X black or putting them in like different racial or ethnic or different conflicts. And I think there's a lot of value to that. And I think you could do something like having it be that this character of Magneto is someone who, like, I mean, there are lots people of many of different racial backgrounds can also be Jewish. You could have someone whose like grandfather was a Holocaust survivor and he has gone through apartheid or racism in some other context. Like there's ways to do it. but I feel like there's going to be so much controversy and so much everyone having a different opinion about how to update those stories, as well as the fact that just if we're talking about a fixed point in history, as our own story gets further and further from that fixed point in history, the characters have to get older and older. Like, I think there's ways to do it, but I just feel like that's going to become so much the focus of the discussion that, yeah, I think I'm just with you. I think like the X-Men movies on Fox were by no means perfect, but they did a lot of the things well, and I just don't feel a need to have more of it right now.
Okay, I have a couple of thoughts. First off, you mentioned the actors, and I
Right.
found that interesting because you talked about two generations of X Men actors, right? Like Patrick
Hmm.
Stewart, Ian McKellen, and then Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy.
Right.
And when the two newer ones were cast, there was a lot of questions, some negativity, nostalgia, whatever you want to call it, and we get that every time. We get
Right.
that every time there's a new Batman cast.
Hmm.
And what I would say regarding that is let the actors cook.
Hmm.
Like I am all for newer people stepping into these roles and giving us their interpretation and doing their best and letting just seeing what they do.
Hmm.
And I'm not here for like any negativity before that we've even seen what they do, right? Like you can have an opinion of like, oh, I don't really see them as a Batman, like Robert Pattinson,
I,
right?
I mean, you did start by saying you don't want these movies either, so I feel like I'm now talking you into wanting these movies.
No, okay. There's a couple of things like the actors, yeah, like recasting them, do it.
Okay.
Let a new generation of actors handle these roles. My I don't want to see these is based on like action and powers. Like
Hmm.
it was so much more dynamic and awesome in animation that I was like super excited for some of these battles, the fight scenes and what they were doing. And so far, like for X-Men at least, it just never translated in that way. The the scene where Wolverine is running and Gambit jumps on his back and uses his powers to charge up Wolverine's claws, that
Hmm.
was amazing. It's like I don't think we've ever gotten anything close to that in
Yeah.
live action. And maybe the fight choreography has gotten better, the CGI has gotten better. I don't know if it's to the point yet. Like X-Men, their power base is so diverse and dynamic, and the things that they can do in battle is so amazing. It's
Hmm.
like I don't know if we're ever gonna get there. That was my thing
I
regarding
think
like
that's
don't
fair,
do it.
and I just want to explain my thing on the actors a little more. For me, it's not that, oh, because one actor did it really well, no one else should ever do it. Although I do think like I don't like remakes. There's so many more stories to tell us. Give us new stories. And for me, McAvoy and Fassbender never felt like they were trying to replace. Like it didn't feel like they had recast because they were now telling a very different chapter in their story, not one that's been told 100 times before. And so, I, you
Yeah, it
know,
was like a prequel.
yeah, exactly. And I just like I just don't want to see the same conflict between the two of them that we've seen before.
Yeah.
And
So
I, like to me, I think would be great is something where maybe it is still Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart. They still want to do it. Are getting quite old, and they've basically passed the mantle on. And we're seeing like a lot of these other new X-Men characters who have not been seen on screen before or haven't been given much attention on screen before. Um, they're getting to and there's the questions of like what happens to the mutant kind when it's not just this, uh two best buds slash lovers slash exes, whatever it is, between Magneto and Professor X. Like that's
mhm.
I would love to see the X-Men like where it starts with Magneto's funeral and Professor X has been passed on for a couple of years, or Professor, and give us like what comes next. I think in some ways that's what I was a little frustrated by, but with 97 is I really believed Professor X was dead and gone, and then when he came back, and I was like, oh, okay, it's just the same old Professor X Magneto struggle that we've seen 100 times before. So yeah, I that's I think the version of the X Men I would love to see. But other than that,
So I do agree with you when you say don't just give us the same stories, because
right.
specifically if the MCU does Dark Phoenix, I'm not going to go see that
Yeah.
because I've seen it twice in live action. They both sucked. I've seen it once in the original animated series, and it was like true to the comics and it was
Hmm.
okay. But you know what? Dark Phoenix is overrated. That's my like swords to the throat Flynn Rider take is like I don't think Dark Phoenix is that good of a storyline that we need to keep doing it over and over.
And honestly, it's got so much misogyny baked into it.
Yeah.
That's fair.
And so I think it's fine. Yes, like I think recasting or having new people do these characters is good, but don't just do the same stories. Yes, I agree with that because like what's going on in X-Men right now, like I don't know right now, but like within the last 10 years, the Krakoa stuff,
Yeah.
which is a new mutant nation, right? That is more, I would say, aggressive
Yeah.
and is I believe a collaboration between Magneto and Charles.
Yeah. They
But
work together now.
Charles like they have kind of like merged their viewpoints and been like, yeah, let's just kind of be more antagonistic towards humans in general. Like Krakoa, if they do an MCU Krakoa, yeah, like
Yeah.
that would be a new story like that I've never seen anywhere like outside of
Hmm.
comic books, right? And then you could have new actors step into these roles that we are these characters we are familiar with but doing new and different things as you
Yeah.
desire, right?
Yeah. I think it could be really good.
But
Well,
I don't know if that's going to happen because
yeah.
Dark Phoenix is safe. Like you can put money in the bank just by calling your movie Dark Phoenix, unfortunately.
Yeah. You can put money in the bank for doing that. You could put money in the bank of Professor X and Magneto agreeing to work together, but something happening to make Magneto angry, and so he goes too far. And like, they're just these are the stories people have told again and again. Well, Riki, thank you as always. Thank you to our members. You're really the lifeblood of this podcast. We have spoken.
Da-da-da-da-da.